Today we're going to be talking about architecting data protection, and we're going to talk a little bit about Rubrik as well, as you can imagine. So, study every word. We're going to have a test on the disclaimer slide at the end. Okay? You ready for the test? You have 60 minutes to prepare. So my name is Rebecca Fitzhugh, for those of you who do not know me. So I'm going to be co-presenting today with
Andrew Miller. You can find, and actually I do want to make sure to point out, because it's relevant here, that Rebecca's VCDX243. I'm guessing that's why some of you may be here, which is a wonderful reason to be here.
She likes to embarrass me.
Yep, and actually this kind of started with, she had a koala picture for her, she had a koala in her picture, so I was like, I've jolly well got a kangaroo picture I can pull up, so we decided to do Australian animals. But I've been at Rubrik for a little while, 7 years on the customer side, 8 years on the partner side. And vExpert and certs if you care about them, right, kind of thing. So what are we going to talk about today? Any good presentation needs to have an agenda. That's like presentation 101 rules, right? But we're actually going to try and not make it too formal. There's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 points. It's mainly we're going to spend about half the time talking about data protection and architectural principles around that. I'm going to spend the other half of the time, and actually maybe a little bit less than half, kind of weaving Rubrik into how it fits into those principles, because we've been doing this IT stuff for a while, so we believe there's legitimate fit into good architectural principles, and we'll be doing some demos in there as we go along. Does that sound fair to everybody? Hopefully? Maybe? Yes? No? I'm getting some nods, so that's great. And we will have some time at the end for Q&A as well. We'll try to repeat the questions, so they'll be on the recording. Now, one just main note here, and I'm actually going to back up on the slides here, is that if you're expecting a presentation that is wholly boring and without any humor or jokes, hopefully the red mustache clued you in at the beginning. That's not going to be the case. So if you'd like to put on Twitter, feel free to. We were trying to get a hashtag of red stash going, but I don't know if we're going to pull it off.
I was like, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah, no. So one big reason why we bother doing this, because I mean, who here lives to think about data protection and backup and recovery? Is this like what you get up in the morning and you think about, or you've dreamed about at night? Someone's, okay, well, okay. Mm-hmm. So there's one person. Good for you. But I mean, the big reason to think about this is because if you've ever been in conversations in your business, or if you're a partner and you're talking with customers, when you talk to the business and you ask them questions like, how much data can you afford to lose? Their answer is usually somewhere around the realm of none, right? And how fast do you need to be back online? Probably like about immediately. And if you've been in IT for a while, you're thinking, I know my capabilities. It's not none and no data loss and get things back online. So what that basically means is that for better or worse, we've got an elephant in the room that we really just don't talk about, and we sometimes don't want to talk about.
Andrew, did you put an elephant on the slide?
I might have. So, we warned you with a red mustache. So if you've never seen a sliding elephant in a presentation, this is your time. But it's really because there's basically, the two don't equal each other, right? And so that's why we need to spend some time digging into this, because the worst time to figure out this expectation misalignment, if you will, is at 2 a.m. in the morning when you can't recover files, or when you're in a DR plan and you're trying to execute it, not testing it, but you're actually trying to execute it. So what are we really protecting against? Now you'll notice here that this intentionally is not about storage array failure or data centers. I mean, we're starting out with, we're trying to protect against things that relate to the business, that relate to finances, to regulation, to even bonuses, because we all care about some of those, especially if they're contractual bonuses out to a customer kind of thing. And especially employee burnout. I mean, it's easy to miss that sometimes, but I mean, I've done, back to that customer side for 7 years, I used to do overnight netware upgrades, right? That makes me look older than I am, maybe even, kind of thing. And I've done storage array head swaps overnight. I mean, this is stuff you're up all night. You're sometimes not at your best. And if you have more of this going on, it can relate from a company perspective to actually impacting the quality of IT just from employee burnout. Now, pardon for a little bit of definition. So we're going to be talking about disaster recovery, operational recovery, business continuity. Want to make sure to clarify, when we talk about disasters, we are talking about events that are major items. They require significant effort to be able to restore to the original performance level. But when we start to think about what that is in our environment, I mean, we can classically think about, wildfires. This is, I believe, a picture of California wildfires, right, kind of thing. But we really need to think about this from a scenario perspective. It's not just think about acts of God or hurricanes. We'll get into some of that, but what does that look like in our environment? So let's illustrate a couple. I do have twin 7-year-old kids at home. They're a little older than this picture stolen from Google now, but if you showed up at home, would this be a disaster to you, right? It might be sabotage, it might be a paint can explosion. If you even want to play it out, right? The TV is the data center, and that's an irretrievable loss, and the couch that might be savable, that kind of thing. But this is where you could think of sabotage in the data center. For Rebecca, she has lived and worked in a couple different places around the world, so I'm going to let her keep going from here.
Yeah, so Andrew, when we were dividing up the slides, he said, you have to do these because you have the worst luck of where you live. And I was like, thanks. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So went to high school in Texas. I don't claim that, so don't tell anybody, please. Tornadoes happen there, right? And what happens if a tornado takes out your data center? I'm originally from a city in the deep south that is shaped like a bowl and surrounded on all sides by water. And sometimes hurricanes happen there. Any idea what city that is? New Orleans, yeah. So nothing bad has ever happened there, right? The reason that I had to finish high school in this place might have been because of this. A lot of fun. Earthquakes, I live in California now. And before that, I lived in Japan for 2 years. And there were some earthquakes that happened when I lived in Japan. But the worst thing that happened when I lived in Japan in 2011 was a little tsunami that took out Miyagi Prefecture. And I was in the military at that time, and we had to provide humanitarian aid, and we lost a lot of communications equipment in a small data center in that area. And so what I found in my career, because of my geographic location, for me personally, it's more of the geography and the natural disasters that affect my career in DR. So I've had to go through a lot of scenarios in the past 12 years of having to fail over.
I think if this IT thing doesn't work out, you could join the Storm Chaser show maybe on the Weather Channel. So
can you imagine me? They just follow me. They'll be like, Rebecca's always in the wrong place at the wrong time. She'll be somewhere bad. But maybe you don't have those natural disasters where you live. But that's not the only thing that can affect IT. That's not the only thing that can affect the business, right? Was anybody affected by this fun thing that happened earlier this year? Who flies a lot? I feel like I'm on a plane more than I'm home. So now when people are like, where do you live? I'm like, LAX, Terminal 7, right? Because that's where I am all the time. And so this is not good for us, okay? Especially those of us who travel a lot for work. Look at that. That's just an excuse. Sorry.
Hopefully no one here works for British Airways.
No offense,
Anybody?
guys.
Let's make sure. Okay. No,
we should have checked that.
British Airways stock, maybe? No? Okay. Good.
So I was following this as it was happening, and I had the same thought as this gentleman. Don't you have DR? Don't you have literally anything that can help you recover from this incident? And I spent 6 years as a freelancer, and I did a lot of contracting, and I was the person who would come in and help design some of these DR solutions. And here's what I know. The contractor always gets blamed, right? So what did British Airways do? Finally, they get it back up, right? After losing 100 million euros, or excuse me, 100 million pounds, so it was about 130 million US dollars. They said, well, our bad, a contractor accidentally unplugged the wrong thing. For me, when I read that, I thought of a lot of questions, and the first one is, what single plug took out the entire data center? And why was there not at least a label in there that said, don't touch this? Right? There was no planning there, right? There was no kind of recovery. And so when that happened, that took them completely by surprise. And that was a pretty embarrassing disaster for that company, right? But while that was very, very public, that happens to a lot of us. And the reality is that, yes, tornadoes happen and hurricanes happen and all these things happen, but one of the greatest enemies when it comes to disaster is really us. We're the problem. Specifically Andrew. Andrew is the problem.
The problem is between the keyboard and the chair. Yeah.
So it's my fault. I got it. So we define what is a disaster, right? But when we start thinking about, okay, great, I know I can be affected by all these different things, but where do I start? How do I start planning for this? And then once I realize I could be affected by, what do I do? Right? What do I do? How do I do this? And so for me, and this is where I'm going to go a little bit boring, spent too much time doing data center architect stuff. first thing I'm going to say is, have you done a business impact analysis? Right? Because what are you potentially being affected by? How important is that to your business? And that's a hard part for a lot of us, because I would much rather sit behind a keyboard and do a lot of like really cool stuff, like write a code, or a script, or do something like that that's really technical. But the reality is that as we move up in our careers, we have to think about the business, because everything that we do impacts that. And the last thing we want is for our business to lose 100 million pounds because I really like getting paid. Right? I really enjoy paychecks magically appearing every 2 weeks. So how does this impact the business, and what is the most important? Right? We need to start prioritizing things.
David, as you look at it, usually this is composed of two components. And you can approach this either from an internal perspective, or there are companies that you can pay money to, and from a professional consulting engagement service. And it's easy sometimes to start with, hey, I'm going to go do an inventory, I'm going to gather performance metrics, I'm going to look at my storage, my servers, all this stuff, right? That's part of it. The other part is like actually talking to people, and especially the line of business owners or the application owners. And the best example I know of that, and this is it used to be at a company where we would actually sell these engagements, had a consultant on site. He's talking to a line of business owner, and they're discussing a certain application that's critical for this guy's department. And he's talking about all the financial impact whenever this application is down. So the consultant's taking notes and trying to make sure to quantify the hundreds of millions of dollars or millions of dollars. 20 minutes later, one of this gentleman's employees pokes his head in the door and says, XYZ application is down. What should I do? The boss says, well, I'm kind of in the middle of this meeting here, and if it's still down, when I'm done this meeting, let me know and I'll call it in. And the consultant's there thinking, like, can we back the conversation up like 20 minutes when you were telling me all the criticality stuff here? So there's a good bit of technical discovery that needs to be done that has to be married up as well with a human aspect and digging in. This is why consultants need soft skills and be able to talk to the business owners, that kind of thing. Because there are things that you will never uncover from the technical side that you'll find on the human side.
Absolutely. And so when we start getting this information and prioritizing what applications really should we be protecting, because realistically, does every single application qualify as a quote-unquote tier 1 app? Does everything really need, for example, synchronous replication, zero downtime? Does every single thing need that? Right?
Yes.
Of course, somebody would always say yes, right? And so when I was in the military, I was deployed, and we took a set of servers down for maintenance when we were in country, and we told everybody days in advance, hey, on Thursday, between this time and this time, we're going to take SharePoint down. You guys love SharePoint? It's my favorite. And so we're going to take it down. And this is like publicized. This is going to go down. We're going to do some maintenance. We have to add these patches and do all this stuff. Within about 5 minutes of us taking down SharePoint during this time period, we had a very high-ranking officer come in and go, did you know SharePoint is down? And we're like, yes, sir. And he goes, well, we can't fight the war with SharePoint being down. And I was like, I didn't say anything at that point. I laughed very hard, like inside, because I was like, can't laugh at the higher-ranking person here. But I was like, actually, no, that's one of the least important servers that we have. We also have missile guiding systems and mapping and all kinds of fun GPS things. SharePoint's actually not tier 1. It's more like down here at a priority 3 or 4, realistically, for the mission of that business, right, of my unit. It's not tier 1. So it's taking that information from the people and then also realizing the impact on the technical and the business side of things, and then pairing them together, because everybody's going to say that their application is the most important. And it's important for us to go through and prioritize them appropriately. Because when we start thinking about something that is priority 1, and we start thinking about things like synchronous replication and active load balancing potentially across multiple sites, that gets very expensive. Very, very quickly. And so realistically, you may not be able to afford to protect all of your applications at that level.
That's where the key part of the business impact analysis is to come out with some financial metrics, because that gives you an indisputable roadmap inside the company to say, this is what we should spend on these things.
Absolutely.
Turn it into common language. Everyone can talk dollars, as much as we hate it sometimes as IT practitioners.
And then that's where an SLA comes in, right? And so with an SLA, this is unfortunately like a lot of like legalese and paperwork. It's a service level agreement. But this tells us effectively what we're obligated to provide in terms of availability, right? And this can be very much a legally binding contract if you think about like service providers. They're providing that service to you. But this can also be used within your organization itself, as we as IT, in this case, are now the service provider, and we're providing these resources to other business units within the company, right? And with SLAs, they're typically measured, we've heard of this at this point, right? 3 nines, 2 nines, right? So we notice that as we increase the amount of availability, thereby decreasing the amount of available downtime in a year, right, that's unplanned, this is starting to get very, very expensive, right? So not everything here can be 5 nines or 6 nines of availability, right? Again, realistically, things may fall more at a 2-9, right, the 99% SLA. But within that, it's time for us as, the IT people or the architects to start really defining things like RTOs and RPOs, right? And so with an RTO, this is a recovery time objective. This is how long do we have to get the service back up, right? With our RPO, this is going to be how old can this data be, right? So a lot of us, when we think of RPOs, we think of like replication intervals, right? Or how often should we be backing up data, for example. So this becomes very, very important to us, right, with the RTOs and the RPOs. And this is where I see sometimes a lot of people will go, yes, we have an SLA of 99.999%, so 5 nines, and then I get back and our RPO is going to be 1 hour. And I go, I'm not the best at math. I will not pretend to be a mathematician or even pretend to have any kind of education in mathematics beyond what I was absolutely required to take. But if you're telling me I cannot exceed about 5 minutes of downtime in a year, mathematically, 1 hour does not fit in 5 minutes, right? So we need to talk about this, right? So one of these has to change. We need to either replicate far more frequently, or we need to talk about renegotiating that SLA, right?
And even sometimes, if you want to be a little provocative, you can say it as how much data can you afford to lose? It makes people kind of like, I can lose, well, yeah, how much can you afford to lose? And how long can you afford to be down? Right, that's kind of flipping it to more negative language to kind of shock people sometimes if you need to.
Because again, like realistically, when we start thinking about it, the smaller that RPO and RTO window are, the more expensive it's going to be for us, right? That's just going to always be causation right there for cost. And so whenever we always hear BCDR as one thing, BCDR, but they're complementary in a way, but they're two different things, right? Business continuity, this is very high level of availability. This is me potentially having a tier 1 application fail in one site, or even potentially like a site lose power, and you not notice, right? The end user should not notice with business continuity. It just magically fails over because you have all of these safeguards in place. You have redundancy everywhere, right? That's not cheap. But disaster recovery is, cool, we lost power in our entire data center, or all of these things just failed. Now we need to recover from it. And at that point, ideally, you have some kind of processes that you're following, be it automated or manual, right, to get that service back online. And then, of course, we have operational, or OR, operational recovery. And this is our kind of our day-to-day things that we are prepared to deal with, right? This host just failed. Wonderful. That's why vSphere HA was invented, right? This NIC just failed. No problem. Rip and replace. Or, hey, we designed in redundancy, so we're actually not affected by that failure at all, right? That's going to be our operational day-to-day type of failures.
There's even one other note, if you don't mind, I'll add in there, is that we often think about single points of failure there, resiliency, MPIO, multi-pathing, whatever you like, vSphere HA. But there's also the aspect of operational recovery. It would be something like Susie from accounting deleted a critical payroll file. That's a big deal, going back to like we all like to get paid. But that really shouldn't be business continuity or disaster. That's like a day-to-day file restore that you ought to just be able to handle, right? So that's an example of something that's critical, huge to the business. But this is operational recovery. So we are going to transition at this point into a little bit of Rubrik. Hopefully that's what you were expecting and wanting when you came here, right? And we're going to weave it into the things that we were talking about, especially the SLAs. There's the things that we put up here weren't just like, let's do a random set of interesting architectural principles we find interesting. They interesting to us on stage, right? So the core concept here is complexity is the enemy. I mean, I started out as the guy out of college who wanted to read the manual every single page in the manual and tweak every single setting and then figure out, and I see some people nodding as I say that actually.
Nerds.
And then you come to like upgrade time and you're like, ooh, all the defaults are off and the overnight upgrade really sucks when that happens and you're trying to figure this stuff back out because you're planning ahead. So the key thing, if there's nothing else that you remember here, complexity is the enemy from a technology perspective. Even though we enjoy building complex stuff, it's why a lot of us started doing what we do. We enjoy that process. But whatever you do, whatever you buy, to simplify your architecture where you can, and also expect more out of it. Now I realize that's a little bit of have your cake and eat it too. And those principles will in some cases force you to either take different architectural approaches or to look at new and disruptive technologies, right? Which is part of what we're going to talk about. So as it relates from an evaluation criteria, what we've seen that makes a difference here, two major categories. First, around reliability of data recovery. If you can't get your data back, right, it doesn't matter. It doesn't exist functionally. So there's things that go into that. Then there's also speed of data recovery. So let's say we spend all this time making sure that I have good backups, I have good replication, all the things that apply to business continuity, DR, OR, et cetera, but I can't get it back fast enough to avoid major financial, reputational, fiscal impact kind of thing. At that point, it's almost like if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there, does it make a sound? If I can't get my data back quickly enough, does it even exist? Does all that effort mean anything? Right? So reliability first, that's got to be there, but then paired up with speed of data recovery. And I didn't mean to do that, but I'm doing a Chris Wall sign right there right now. So that's what he does in pictures. Yeah. So as we dig into reliability of data recovery, 2 points there. First, simplicity of setup and day two operations, and we'll get into SLA policy as we go here. So simplicity of setup is really around that if you have complex products, and this is previous lives on the partner side where I have products we'd have take weeks or months to even fully implement, or you have a resident on site to set things up. How many of the features are you actually going to use there, right? I mean, odds are you're not going to use as many, as well as if it takes a lot of time to maintain. Any given day, it may not be in the state that you need it to be, right? So from a Rubrik perspective, as we looked at data management space, because that's what we're really focused on. The first primary use case that we've been diving into has been backup and recovery, but at a larger level, data management. When you look at this space hasn't really changed a lot in the last 20 years or so, right, give or take. And I'm talking from a design center perspective, okay? This is that you get software from company A, you put it on servers from company B, tape drives from company C, maybe a offsite archive from company D, right? That kind of thing. Now, there have been some changes, and this is even, I've done a good bit with deduplicated systems and source and target deduplication, and even running Tivoli Storage Manager going to a NetApp R200, right? I'm talking about deduplication and disk, the impact of that from a backup and recovery perspective, wonderful. But those didn't do anything to address complexity, right? They added more things in. The stack keeps getting bigger and bigger. And what that leads to is the best day as we're setting this stuff up is the first day, right? You get it all up. All the scripts and jobs and schedules are wonderfully aligned and everything's running well. And then over time, it becomes a little more like this, right? I mean, you come in every morning. You get your Mountain Dew or coffee, because that's been a personal shift over the years from Mountain Dew to coffee, right? You look at your jobs and scripts and you spend a couple hours cleaning things up, and because it's not as nice as it was when you started out, that kind of thing. It's just because the data center has grown and changed. So with Rubrik, what we do is we take all those different components and we collapse them down into a single appliance that is the hardware, and there's disks and flash in there, of course, as well as the software, the backup catalog, and that it's actually scale out as well. So it's a software fabric, and we'll sell it to you with hardware to achieve the simplicity goal, because that's an overarching design goal from a Rubrik perspective. And that when you do this is a scale out file system, scale out metadata catalog, so there's no single points of failure in here, as well as even job scheduling. And if you've done some of this stuff for a while, you're used to single or dual controllers and forklift upgrades. You have points where there's islands of deduplication and silos. We don't have those. It essentially scales out as wide as you want it to go with native integration. This is be up front a little bit of the core technology walkthrough slide, so I'll just embrace that as we do it. But standing it up, you can do that within 30 to 60 minutes. Of course, you've got to have stuff like IP numbers and 10 gig network and the space in your rack, that kind of thing, and rack cage nuts. And at that point, it'll actually plug into vCenter, into SQL, other products, and actually do auto discovery. As you move along, your first backup, it has to be a full, but from there on out, we do incremental forever with deduplication and compression, even using parallel ingest to flash. We have a flash tier intentionally to store the metadata for speed, also for initial backups. Those are some other topics that we'll talk about later as we go. Automation. Now, sometimes you hear automation and you think, oh, that's like writing scripts and its APIs, and we're going to go there in a minute because there's a lot of cool stuff. But when we're talking automation, this is talking about actual having policies. And I'm not saying policies where it's like 500 settings on 50 different screens and that's the policy, right, kind of thing. And I'll actually see this in the demo in a minute as Rebecca goes through it. This is where you set up the key characteristics that you care about, how frequently do you back up, how long to keep it, archiving your replication, and then you walk away. And what you don't do is you don't set up jobs and schedules and tasks and keep them aligned and move them around. Instant recovery. We'll see this as well. We talked about RTO a little bit, right? So if you've seen any of some of the Rubrik website or other places, you may have seen the term near zero RTO. And if you're a technical background like me, you kind of instinctively like, hey, that can't be right. That can't be true, right? Because near zero, that's not real. But we're actually going to show how you can actually have a virtual machine within 60 seconds actively running off of Rubrik. We're not primary storage, not intended to be. But we can actually facilitate bringing workloads back almost instantly. And this is both for VMware and SQL. And of course, you can dive inside for search and file restore. There's got to be security. If there wasn't, you probably wouldn't want to look at it, whether it's in flight or at rest encryption. There's a critical aspect here that relates to ransomware. We'll talk about that later. And then cloud. Who here is doing something with cloud? Or your boss is telling you you need to do something with cloud. Or your CIO needs a cloud strategy that's not just a checkbox.
Thought we were all going to be in the cloud in 2017.
I thought we're in the cloud today. We don't know it yet. A little bit of Matrix, maybe. So then there's actually native integration from archiving perspective to get the similar economics to tape, as well as that you can even take virtual machines that have been archived into the cloud and convert them to run in AWS or Azure. So in short, you can take all these pieces. If you're like me, get red duct tape, put in your data center, all the systems that you've had blood, sweat, and tears with over the years, all of that can collapse down to this. And what's more, if you want to run it on premises, you can, but you can also wholly run this software stack in AWS or in Azure, and that is available today. That is a generally available thing. That is not something that we have announced and that you will actually be able to do months or years from now. You can actually do this today. Now, what we're going to dig into as we jump into the demo is both the core Rubrik pieces as well as we talked about SLA, and you may recognize a couple of these acronyms up here, like, how frequently do you back up? That's kind of like RPO, right? How much data could I lose, as well as that RTO piece. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, and we will change over here and go through a little bit of a demo.
Sure. So first thing I wanted to show you was how easy it is to add vCenter. So Andrew mentioned the fact that once vCenter gets added, we auto-discover all of your virtual machines. And so let me show you how incredibly difficult it is. Go here, up to our lovely widget. And then you choose Manage vCenter, and then you hit Add. Voila. It's a lot of hard work, I know. IP, FQDN, username, password. And then from there, give it a couple of minutes, you're going to see all of your virtual machines get populated. Okay? So then the next step that we would want to do after our configuration of the vCenter is going to be to assign an SLA. And you can use one of our canned SLA policies, or you can, of course, create your own. Right? And so if I just simply hit add, name my SLA domain, so let's call it Barcelona. That sounds nice. And then from there, we're going to specify what the actual components of our SLA policy are going to be. So in this case, we're going to specify how often we should be protecting your machines. Okay? And so this can be the hourly, daily, monthly, okay, and then of course our yearly, and then how long do we want to actually keep that for? And this is going to be, in this case, on the brick itself, right, on the storage that we're providing. So from there, let's do one every hour and keep that for 15 days. Okay? I don't have to define everything. If that's all I want, that's all I want, and I'm done. Okay? And then from there, I can specify a window. Of course, I'm going to recommend always, as the person who says you should always be protecting your data, that you don't set a window and protect your data always. But we know that
complex if you don't need to.
Yeah, but we know that some companies do have defined backup windows, right? And you can go ahead and define that right here. And then Andrew mentioned that at the beginning, we do a first full, and then everything is incremental from that point forward. Now, if we're talking about a massive machine and you think that you're worried about it happening during business hours, something like that, you can postpone the first full until a later point, right? So you can say, you know what, don't actually do the first full of this 20 terabyte whatever until 2 a.m., right? So by default, it's going to say first opportunity, but you can go ahead and specify for that to happen at a later point. Now, once you've configured that, then the next thing is going to be going to your remote settings. And this is where we can change what our on-brick retention is, and we can do that a couple of different ways. So the first thing is that we can specify archival. And so you can specify archival to the public cloud, to an on-premises NAS device, or my personal favorite, tape.
Curse you.
He had to write the paper about it, and he's a little bitter. No, I'm kidding. And so in this case, I could go ahead and choose S3, and I can now archive all of my data to S3, and I can specify when that happens. So I can say, for example, I should be retaining my data on the physical brick for, let's say, 8 days. And then after 8 days, we want to archive it out to S3, and then we're going to retain it for another week there, because that's our strategy. Now, of course, you may have a much longer retention period, and you can go ahead and define that.
And if you remember, like we talked about RPO, we said that on the previous screen, RTO, if you think about if most of your file restores happen within 7 days or 30 days, that's what you want to keep local on the brick. And the brick in this case is the local Rubrik hardware. The rest you could archive out to the cloud, and it's still indexed. It's all still the same catalog as even it moves out there.
And we can also do replication. Right, so Andrew alluded to the fact, well, he didn't allude, he straight up said, hey, we have Rubrik available in your public cloud, right? So you can run Rubrik Cloud Cluster in AWS and Azure. You can run it on premises in a physical brick, or if you have a robo-type scenario where you have branch offices, you can also run it as a virtual appliance, okay? But it's effectively the same software. So we can do Rubrik device to Rubrik device replication. So that'd be brick to brick, or for example, a software appliance into the physical brick in the main data center. And we can specify that replication and how often that should occur and what that replication target is. Okay. Now,
and of course, that even relates to from a DR perspective. We'd love you to buy the same amount of Rubrik at the remote site as your primary site, but you don't need all that at the remote site usually for a disaster recovery restore scenario. What you really need is probably the last 3 or 5 or 7 days. So that's the reason that's available there from a slider perspective.
And then once you've created your SLA policy, the next thing to do is just go and assign it. Now, I can assign this to an individual virtual machine, which I've just pulled up. I have some VMs named after myself. Okay, so I've got a Linux VM, a SQL VM, and just a plain old Windows VM. And at this point, I can do a per VM assignment by just simply selecting that and then doing manage protection. Or I could assign this at a folder level. If you've built out your folder structure in your VM and template view, right? You can go ahead and select a folder and assign the SLA policy there. Or of course, you can do it at a cluster level within your vCenter. Right? So there's some flexibility here for the assignment. And what's great too is if you add a VM to that cluster later or to that folder later, it's going to be automatically protected by your SLA. Right? So then I don't have to go back in there and manually protect that virtual machine.
Cool. Shall we keep talking? First demo, we actually have a couple more left. We tried to kind of interleave them. We actually really thought about like, hey, should we do the classic demo at the end, slides first? And I was like, no, it's a little riskier to kind of interleave, especially live demos, but 1 down, 2 to go. So we'll see how it keeps going. Don't curse it.
He just cursed me. Great.
Second, so hopefully this makes sense here. When we're talking about simplicity of setup, I mean, the stand up of the box, 30 to 60 minutes, you create a policy, you map it to vCenter. Now to be crystal clear, we are not VMware only. We're at VMworld. We're going to illustrate with VMware, and that is where we started in all truth. But there's multiple hypervisors in there. You can find them out pretty easily, as well as there's also support for Windows and Linux and SQL and Oracle and more coming along the way, kind of thing. But the key piece is that you can take that policy construct and apply it no matter what the data source is. And that, to me, especially for an operational background, that drives a dramatically different amount of day-to-day operations. And we do literally have customers and case studies on the site where they talk about the dramatic reduction of day-to-day operational time that it takes. And this goes toward that when you need it, it's actually going to work and be available. Both you can get it up, use the features, as well as that it'll be working when you need it. Next, immutability. who here is familiar with this term? It's a little bit newer. I'm curious. Show of hands or nods. I have a couple. Thanks for cool. Okay, a few, some, not many. So this has actually come about as a term more recently, especially as ransomware has become more prevalent, frankly. It's basically the core concept is there anything that can change the previously backed up data and cause it to be deleted, corrupted, et cetera. And I'm not talking here about someone getting physical access to your data center. I'm not talking about an administrator being able to like delete things inside the administrative interface. I'm talking about like external systems that can say, and this is actually a real example of things that have happened. Say a SQL server's box getting compromised, his desktop getting compromised, and he has the CIFS or SMBv3 share mounted that the SQL server is doing all its backups to. Not a wrong thing, but his box get compromised, his files get encrypted locally, it reaches out via his credentials, encrypts his attached NAS shares, which happens to encrypt the backups, and then it gets access to the SQL servers and starts to encrypt the MDFs and LDFs. That's a really bad day. In that scenario, what you need is something where you can say for sure that any backups that you've taken cannot be compromised or changed by new backups. Not that you may not back up newly encrypted data, but that those backups can't change the previous one. So from a Rubrik perspective, the reason I mention this is, while there are systems that cannot be made to be immutable, there are some that can be configured to be immutable via some various number of steps. And there are some, such as Rubrik, and actually this is one of the only ones that I know of, to be honest, that are immutable by default. This is designed in from a file system level, from a backup application level, where any backups that we take in never affect the previous ones from say, a ransomware standpoint, even though we're doing incremental forever. So it's a relatively simple concept. The reason that I focus on it here is because ransomware has become more prevalent, and the statistics that we're seeing are anywhere from 50 to 70% of companies per year are going to get impacted. The reason this matters here is that if you're having to use a system such as backup and recovery as your last line of defense after all the network and proxies and virus scanning, et cetera, if you have a system that you're going to need once or twice a year, but you have to maintain on a daily basis, it's probably not going to be there when you need it to be, because you had to pay that daily operational tax for a once a year benefit, right? And actually, I might have a whole presentation on that too. But we'll trim that down to 2 minutes here.
Yeah, we couldn't tell.
Yeah. And I should have kept going, because this actually talks about, we've got pieces in the file system, we've got pieces up in the data management layer, even some pieces around here. And this is actually in there was a Tech Field Day 12 presentation where we actually walk through the Atlas file system in depth, and it relates to some of this, how it's append only. Next, speed of data recovery. We've done things to make sure that we've got the data, that it's going to be there when we need it. Can we get it back quickly enough to matter? So first, there would be search. Can we actually search through? So from a Rubrik perspective, anytime we ingest a virtual machine or any data type, we actually index it. But specifically for virtual machines, we actually crack inside the VMDK, and you can actually go and index all the file names, and you can find those individual files to restore them, even inside, which is pretty cool. But it gets even cooler when we start to talk about live mount, which is how we do the near zero RTO. So I'm just going to let Rebecca show that one to you. And I should be good and punch over here. Man, I almost got the segue right.
So picking up right where we left off, right? So we're still looking at my 3 virtual machines that I've named after myself here. So if we dig into, for example, my Windows virtual machine, it's going to bring up kind of a nice interface that gives me a good overview of the protection of this particular VM. So I'm going to be able to see, for example, what vCenter it's in. I'm going to be able to see what SLA policy. I'm going to be able to see if this virtual machine's been live mounted and actually running as a live mount somewhere. How old is my oldest snapshot, newest, how many total I have, and then to me what's very important is, am I experiencing any problems? Is my virtual machine not being protected for any reason? And I'm going to be able to quickly see if we've missed any kind of protection window, right? Now, over here on the right-hand side, it's going to give us a nice calendar view, okay? So in the calendar view, I could, for example, go ahead and select a date. I would pick the one that hasn't finished protecting. So if we look at like last night, I have a backup at 11:36. Okay, so from here, what I can do is just simply hit the ellipses on the right-hand side, and I can choose to mount it, the live mount. I can choose to do an instant recovery. I'm going to demonstrate the live mount because I don't want to instantly recover my VM because it's still working and happy right now, and I don't want it to die and then come back as an 11:36 p.m. Okay, so I can also export it and I can browse for my files, right? So file level recovery is pretty important. So if I do a file browse, if I know exactly where that file is on my virtual machine, I'm going to be able to navigate very quickly to it and download it or restore it. But if I don't know where it actually is, but I know what it's called, I can just simply come up here and say example.txt. And it shows me the exact same thing, right? Pretty quickly. And then from there, I'm going to be able to see all the different versions that are available to me, and I'm going to be able to download it right here, this text file, onto my laptop. Or I can, of course, restore it back to the virtual machine. Okay.
Have you ever been in a scenario where someone says, I need file back, I don't know when I messed it up? And each time you have to iterate back to a previous point in time, it's kind of painful? Versus like, this one, that's the good one.
Yeah, so that's just one of the options, right? So what we can also do is, of course, do the live mount. So if I hit mount, I select an ESXi host, and I have the option to move the NIC, right? So if I'm very much worried about some kind of naming or IP conflict, I can protect myself from it, get into that virtual machine, do what I need to do, potentially add back the NIC if I need network communication, right? So let's go ahead and mount that. And while that's happening, I want to talk about something else. So the one thing that I didn't kind of briefly mention was the option to launch on cloud. So that's something called Cloud On, or it's effectively cloud instantiation. So what that's allowing us to do at this point is take this vSphere virtual machine and launch it on a public cloud provider. Now, I can do that manually, which is what I'm doing right here. If I click launch on cloud, it would walk me through the steps manually of choosing where I want to launch it, what availability zone, all of that fun stuff. Or I could actually choose to do a cloud conversion and say, every single time you protect my virtual machine, I want you to place it also as an instance on AWS, for example. And I have a couple of options there as well, where I can say, not only do I want you to do it, I want you to do it every single time, and I want you to keep all of the different versions. So that I'm able to go and see those AMIs available in AWS and launch instances from there at different points in time. Now, I don't have to do that. Right? I can, of course, always just do it manually.
If you've noticed, we have just busted outside of the backup and recovery realm. We were kind of flirting with it with some of the stuff we already talked about. But I have a friend who used to be a DBA, and he got super excited about this because he always had issues with schema upgrades. He was like, so I could take my VMs or my SQL databases, because we can do this same thing with SQL as well in some cases, and I could actually be able to test my schema upgrades on on-demand hardware that I can get in the cloud, because I could never get the extra test dev hardware that I needed, right? So there's a whole number of really fascinating use cases that this unlocks.
You talk too much, because now they didn't get to see how fast it is. Oh, he ruined it. All right, so it's already powered on.
2 minutes.
So I don't know if you were watching while he was talking, but as soon as I clicked over there, it was already powered on. And I talked for about a minute and a half, so I talked too long as well. I wanted to show you within a minute. So at this point, I can pop over to my favorite UI in the world. So all your guys' favorite too, right? All of us are like, oh, an HTML5 web client? That sucks. No, said no one ever, right? Okay. And I can go ahead and do a quick search for it. And what you're going to see whenever I do a search, by quick, flash quick, I'm going to be able to see my Windows virtual machine, and then notice that I have another one named similarly, but it's appended by a date timestamp. And that date timestamp illustrates the live mount, okay, and when it was live mounted, okay. It's available right now, and I can start going through it and looking at whatever configuration that I might have messed up, or try to figure out what went wrong in that time period, or do any kind of general testing or sandboxing or anything, right? We have a lot of kind of use cases at this point, and I can start using it while not affecting the actual production running VM.
We'll go back over here, and I think you were going to, right? Good?
Yep.
Cool.
So, with this, I guess now past life of being a consulting architect, the one thing that I really liked to do was to make the decision, right? It's not really fun when you go to a client site and they go, so you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do this. And I go, well, why am I here? I thought I was getting paid to make decisions and design the infrastructure, right? So I like options. And one of the things that really drew me, there's a couple of things that drew me to Rubrik. First thing was a lot of flexibility in how I design it, right? With the creation of the SLA policies, but not only that, the ability to do a long-term archival to the cloud, or long-term archival on premises, right? Or to tape, or whatever I want to do there. Not only that, I have got the software version, I've got the cloud version, I have the hardware version, and I can do replication, I can do archival between, right? So I like the flexibility here of how I can design this. And the second thing that really drew me to Rubrik was the fact that it's an API-first platform. So Andrew talked about automation in terms of we can automatically protect your VMs. All you do is assign a quick policy, apply it to a cluster, auto-magically, everything happens, right? But there's more to than just that. Because you might be going, cool, this is VMworld, I'm also running VRA, and we're doing all of our virtual machine provisioning through VRA. I don't want to have to go now and pop back over to another UI and make sure something's protected, or to change something, or to recover something. I don't want to do that. And I'm using VRA as an example, but that's just one example. You might be Puppet, SaltStack, something like that, that you're able to use to consume RESTful APIs from somewhere else. And we have an API-first platform that allows you to consume our APIs and automate that elsewhere, right? So I didn't hit next. Andrew, I thought you were going to be like, Rebecca.
Sorry.
So repeat all of the things I said just now about Puppet, SaltStack, right? And you've got the nice guy walking with Swagger, right? Which is what our APIs are built off of. So if you want to switch me.
One more demo so far. Ah.
So this is going to be a quick one. What I wanted to show you is, like, for me, I'm not Andrew. Did you hear him say earlier when he likes to get a new product, his favorite thing to do is pop open the manual? Did you hear him say that?
That was the old me.
I was like, no, let me tell you what I never did. And that was open up the documentation and read from top to bottom. I was like, I'm going to figure it out, trial by fire. It's going to make me better in the process. No. So, and then the worst part is, like, trying to go to the web. I just don't have the patience for it, right? I'm trying to find the right version of documentation. So with Rubrik, you may have noticed that lovely .18 here, our UI. It's the same thing right here. You can just append it with /docs and then v1, and it has all of our API documentation, and it walks you through not only a little bit about the actual form of how you would structure everything, but it also gives you examples and shows you how you can consume it, and you can pull that code right there if you wanted to, and then just change certain variables. So it's very easy to use, to navigate, right, and to start planning how you can use it elsewhere. So as an example, VRA, I pulled up one of my virtual machines that I have provisioned through VRA. I'm able to manage it, and notice right here, we custom integrated the ability to do that instant recovery, or to do the live mount, or to be able to do an on-demand snapshot where I go, you know what, I'm about to do something crazy on this VM, I probably should back it up real quick, right? And I can go ahead and then, of course, recover a file, assign an SLA domain. Effectively, anything that you can do via our UI, you're able to do via our APIs as well, right?
And the, keep going. I don't want to steal your thunder.
Okay.
I'll make sure before you.
So, I did not make that. That's too cool. I'm not that good at Power. Like, look at that. I was like, whoa, that's pretty. So we showed you how easy it is to integrate with vSphere, but it's not just vSphere, right? As evidenced by the fact that we have the RESTful APIs and we can consume this in various places. It's easy to work with an SLA policy, and you're able to very, very quickly search. I actually saw somebody on the front row go, when I did, was that you? Yeah. First time I saw it, I was like, no way, let me do it. And then I did, I was like, okay, they weren't faking it.
And from an API perspective, there are one or two things I wanted to add, which is that, to be super clear, our GUI consumes our own API. You can even pop open developer mode in Chrome. If you ever played with the vSphere Sling a long time ago, what calls vCenter was making, that kind of thing, so you could script it. It's essentially almost the same thing, except we are literally calling our own API. And if you've ever been like me and you've done some scripting, you get to the very end, and there's like one critical function at the very end of your whole project you can't do via the API or a CLI, whatever it is, right? In this case, up front, anything that you can do in the GUI and Rubrik can be called via API, via a RESTful API, which to me is a critical thing in actually spending the time to launch into automating this stuff. If you don't know that up front, it's a little queasy, like, should I go and spend the time doing it?
I think if you were listening to the keynotes over the past couple of days, I think one of the things that's very evident is we're moving up the stack, right? And so this is becoming more to many organizations.
Having an API as an API that can call everything is a RESTful API. Modern API is an evaluation criteria. We do literally have a customer case study out on the website for Lang's building supply, where it was actually an example of ransomware, but it was recovery in that context, where they used a custom script. So this is around speed of recovery. They actually went and queried a couple different servers that had been compromised by ransomware, got the file list, all the .enc files, piped it into a script that called our API to then put all those files back. You may say, well, hey, they could have just restored the whole server, a couple of them. Well, not everything on the servers had gotten encrypted. They didn't want to roll everything to the encryption. So this actually let them write a script to be able to pull in. So that was something that was uniquely enabled by the API. That is, of course, what leads to what we see here from a wonderful graph perspective of, we've alluded to the dramatic drops in daily management time, how fast you can get it up and running. The base Rubrik footprint in your data center is 2U. You can grow from there. We have a lot of pictures on Twitter and LinkedIn where you see the reduction in rack space. We've talked about near zero RTO and some of the savings because when we usually look at this, and this is to be more of a technical session, but there's usually when you work with a local sales team, they'll end up doing a total cost of ownership, TCO, and always almost come in at the 20 to 40% less. It feels odd to say that at the end because sometimes if the financial criteria don't work, you can't even look at a product, right? But in this case, hopefully this was interesting enough, but know that the finances do work as well as you get into a discovery process with a local sales team. With that, I think we are done. And that's our tagline, in case you didn't guess. Don't back up, go forward. Does anybody have any questions? And we do have a microphone here, so that I think we have a question in the front here, so that the questions can be on the recording. Thank you.
Backup of VMs is really easy products, but what about database backup? Can you backup logs? Can you do point-in-time recovery with log forward?
Yes.
And can you do HANA backup, for example?
Sorry, what was the last one?
SAP HANA, SAP HANA.
Okay. So from a database perspective, we support NSQL Server. We have some, just being totally upfront, we have some manual methods to support SAP HANA. I'm not going to pretend around that. As it specifically relates to SQL Server, though, do specifically support both full and simple mode, fully support transaction logging, and the point-in-time recovery is actually a little bit of a, because there's this really cool slider bar where you basically drag to the point in time you want. Under the covers, Rubrik goes and restores the full backup and then rolls the logs for you, which if you're doing it at 2 a.m. in the morning is a wonderful thing. So you don't have to do my full, get these logs, roll them in the right order, that kind of thing. So, yes. Great question. I love it. I like giving the answer. So, any other questions?
Yes. What's about the...
One second. Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks.
What's about the retention time? I've seen in the interface that you had 15 days.
That's just what I configured. So you can set it from far longer than that. So for example, I could have specified a yearly and then kept it for 10 years, right? Now, realistically, you may not have enough storage on one physical appliance to hold that many backups. And so that's where our scale out fabric comes into place. So, and it's not just for storage, but even more compute or storage. You can drop in another brick and it all scales globally.
It's also where the cloud archive comes into play because you keep a certain amount. We have a lot of, the magic times seem to be 1 year, 3 years, or 7 years from a regulatory perspective. So a lot of 7 years, they'll keep 30 to 60 days on the brick. The rest goes out to, I'm glad you asked that because that reminded me. So a lot of times the economics of archiving to cloud do not work very well. If you have 100 gig VMDK and you need a 10K file, Amazon will charge you a lot of money to pull the whole thing back. So from a Rubrik perspective, we actually can go inside that and just pull back the subsection needed the VM to get just that file back. So there's even some very intentional low-level engineering to help make the cost economics of cloud work for long-term retention. And we do have a lot of customers that are doing 3, 5, 7-year retentions.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
That's another great question. Maybe remind me of one thing we had. I think we have one right over there. Or any other questions? In the front again. Okay.
Back to you.
Then we can go back to you if you want. So.
What about external storage? Can I reuse some other appliances like data domain or NAS devices, or just use?
You can. You can. So the way to see that is, so first the hardware that Rubrik itself runs on, the Rubrik software, we'll sell you an appliance. We're also certified on various Cisco UCS and HP and Lenovo configurations. You have an external, say, data domain and NAS. We actually do have customers doing this. So that's where you can point for the archive. You can point to tape. You can private cloud. It can also point to NFS. And so we do see people who say, hey, I've got a sunk cost here. Now, being totally transparent, we are deduplicating doing incremental forever compression. So sometimes that may or may not be cost effective because some of the deduplication appliances are relatively expensive per terabyte. They work out financially because they have some secret sauce, right? If we aren't sauce. But we do have customers doing that where they have some newer systems and we're like, man, I've got a sunk cost here. It's not amortized yet. I need to do something with this that's legitimate. So, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions, or we'll give you 5 minutes back. Amazingly, everyone's still here, which is great.
Time. I'm calling it.
I think with that, it's lunchtime.
All right. Thank you very much.
If you...